Pen and ink is one of the most versatile mediums available to a fashion illustrator. There are various types of pens like fountain pen, ball pen, marker pens, and so on. Though the preferred ink is black in most cases, there are also colored inks as per one's wish. Now I am going to show you a small demo on how to use pen and ink to create fabrics. Now watch carefully the tip of a micro tipped pen, which looks different from other pens. The pen has to be held as perpendicularly to the paper as possible while sketching. Here I am using a rapidograph pen. The ink is also rapidograph ink, and I am using black ink to do my rendering. Any fashion illustrator willing to use rapidograph pen must note that the pen always has to be used perpendicular to the paper. When the pen is tilted at an angle, it doesn't create continuous lines. So, the illustrator has to practice extensively to master medium. Here you can see that I am drawing parallel lines one after the other without much variation in the first rendering. The second rendering, I am using the same kind of parallel lines but with a variation. You can see that by drawing lines very close to each other, I have created two stripes, or in other words, you can see lightness and darkness in this strip of rendering. So, it's a very simple technique to create light and shadow, texture, or patterns using the same pen. It is only limited by the creative abilities of the fashion illustrator. Now watch carefully how trying to create a thin stripe in between the broad stripes that I have already rendered. One must note here that I have been continuously drawing only parallel lines using the same pen. So you can imagine how much of variation an illustrator can show using different sizes of pen. So it's the ability and creativity of the illustrator that is going to define the variety in your rendering. Here I am using a very famous method called cross-hatching method. This cross-hatching method involves drawing parallel lines in one direction, for example horizontally, then adding vertical lines so that small squares are formed on the paper. After that, right now I am adding diagonal lines to create more darkness on the paper using my pen. If you watch carefully, the lines crisscross each other, thereby creating a visual texture as well as adding darkness to the rendering. Though I am using a specific tipped pen and parallel lines to do my rendering, you might note the subtle differences that make the rendering interesting. So, as an illustrator, according to your requirements, you will have to decide on the size of the pen that you want to use as well as the distance between the various lines that you are drawing. While using a rapidograph pen, it is up to the illustrator to decide on the distance between the parallel lines, the variations that one can introduce by using different pens, and so on. Most of the illustrators use this cross-hatching method to make the renderings interesting to the viewer. Another specialty of this rapidograph pen and its ink is that it is a very long lasting medium. The illustrator only has to choose a superior quality of paper so that the rendering might last as long as 100 years. This ink also does not fade with time. If the illustration is preserved properly, the renderings look as if they are new. It is also a medium very useful for accurate reproductions. For example, in printing or similar usages. Here you can see that I am repeatedly drawing parallel lines and the darkness of the rendering keeps on increasing with each stroke of the pen. So this is a very useful technique as far as fashion illustrators are concerned. Here I am going to show you how to render some patterns. This kind of rendering is very useful for fashion illustrators. As a fashion illustrator, you will be required to show a lot of variety in dress materials. So it will be very useful to experiment with a variety of textures or patterns. Here I have drawn some parallel lines using a rapidograph pen. Now I am trying to create stripes by drawing lines in the opposite direction of the parallel lines that I rendered previously. Here, note that now I am drawing my lines very close to each other so that it creates a darkness. On top of that, I am adding more lines to make it look darker in certain places so that it creates a pattern. Observe the quality of lines that I am rendering. Watch closely the subtle variations in light and shadow that I have created. You can see certain dark areas within the dark stripes that I have drawn. The pattern that I have visualized is rendered by showing light and shadow in the rendering. Now I am also introducing two smaller stripes by drawing zigzag continuous lines. So these are all simple techniques to do a pattern or a texture. A fashion illustrator can actually create numerous such variations which will be very useful in fashion illustration. One can use dots as I am doing now, or stripes, or one can introduce light and shadow as per one's requirements. Now I am connecting the dots with a continuous line so that it starts resembling a fabric. Now, kindly note that I have started using continuous lines unlike previously. Previously, I have used mostly only parallel lines. You will have to compare the effect created by parallel lines, which look more regular. But now I have started using continuous freehand lines to create a kind of texture which is entirely different from the renderings that I did previously. Here, one must note that the lines will have to be as uniform as possible without disturbing the viewer. Kindly note the way I uniformly try to fill the space that I have used for the rendering. Did you observe that so far my line has been continuous from the beginning of the rendering? You must also note the consistency of my lines. I have consciously avoided showing too many variations in my lines. You can see that the rendering already looks finished with just one line which I have drawn continuously throughout this rendering. This texture as it is might be used for various purposes like dress materials. Now I am introducing a stripe pattern in my rendering. Watch the short strokes that I am using to create the stripes. Here, one must note that I am not using a ruler to make the lines accurate because that might give a different feel to my rendering. I now actually want the rendering to look more informal. One should closely watch the edges of the stripes here and how natural they look. You can visualize what kind of a difference will a ruler make here. Of course, you will have to use a ruler if you require a very accurate stripe. Now I am trying to introduce a small stripe in between the broad stripes that I have already rendered. Carefully watch the usage of pen, the kind of strokes that I am doing by rendering to and fro strokes in a very limited area to create the small stripes. Now make note here that I am not drawing continuous lines. I am actually marking dots on the paper in a very organized manner. I am using the pen as parallel as possible. You can actually see certain parallel lines forming on the paper even though I have not drawn a continuous line. So this kind of consistency has to be followed by the fashion illustrator. One must be very thorough in drawing such points or lines according to one's wish. As I am using a rapidograph pen, I must be very careful on the amount of pressure that I am applying on the pen. Now you can clearly see that I am using more dots in between the spaces created previously. Watch carefully how I have filled the space using only points. Though there are subtle variations in the points, it actually adds beauty or aesthetics to the rendering. After using black ink to create the texture that I required, now I have started using a normal ballpoint pen with blue ink to draw some small flowers on the texture that I have already created. The blue colored ballpoint pen rendering of flowers actually creates a lot of variety in the rendering. If so much of variety is visible by just using black and blue ink, one can imagine the kind of variety an illustrator can create by using different types of pen with different types of inks. So, as an illustrator, one must be versatile in using various mediums according to one's wish. Here, the amount of timing an illustrator has to do a rendering also matters because one has to do a rendering as quickly as possible in this profession. Now watch carefully the quality of lines that I am drawing. Watch the subtle difference in the curvatures that I am using. Though all the lines are parallel to each other so far, I have introduced a kind of shaky feeling to the lines that I am drawing. This makes the stripes more interesting when compared to straight lines. Also watch the distance between the lines. There are more spaces in certain areas while the space is very narrow in certain other areas. Watch carefully how I am introducing more lines between the lines that I have already drawn. Here I am creating a kind of pattern where you start seeing stripes in the rendering. Also watch the tip of the pen and how I have created a lot of difference between the lines that I drew previously. So the fashion illustrator has to practice such techniques to make one's illustration as interesting as possible. Now I am drawing another set of lines that intersect the previous lines perpendicularly. You can see that I have created a kind of checks in my rendering. The kind of curvatures that I have used actually creates a kind of texture that can be visualized by the viewer. Now watch carefully how I am using the pen to create a kind of thick and thin line along with the lines that I have previously drawn. One must take great care in defining the distance between these lines. Some kind of consistency must be followed to create a pattern in your rendering. These kind of patterns are very useful while doing actual fashion illustrations. One must practice and be ready for any kind of pattern that one might come across while doing fashion illustrations. Watch carefully the naturalness of the rendering. Observe the way I am using the pen to create the texture that I have visualized. Now see how I am placing some discontinuous lines and dots in the rendering. This adds variety and interest to the rendering. Here I am going to show you how I am going to use blue ball pen to create a background pattern or texture on which I am going to apply black workmanship to create a interesting rendering. You had already seen where I have done a background using black rapidograph pen, on top of which I rendered small flowers using blue ball pen. Here I am using blue ball pen to create a pattern which looks like a checked pattern. The only variation is on one side I have used continuous freehand lines, while making the checks I have avoided using continuous lines and instead I am using broken lines but which are very uniform in nature. So this has created a kind of texture as well as a pattern on the paper. So the viewer can now visualize a fabric according to the lines that I have drawn. Watch the movement of the pen in a very subtle manner, which creates the required texture. See how the various lines combine to give a final effect to the rendering. So the fashion illustrator has to practice a lot to achieve this kind of consistency in one's rendering. Now note here that I am using rapidograph pen to introduce black dots in this rendering. Watch carefully the movement of the tip of the pen to make the small dots required. Also note that the size of the dots are similar to each other and spaced uniformly. These are all important aspects that a fashion illustrator must note, because if there is no uniformity in your rendering, it might create a disturbing picture to the viewer. So, long hours of practice is required to master such techniques. Nothing else can substitute this kind of practice. Now I am again using blue ball pen to create some stripes in the rendering. Observe carefully the strokes that I am rendering using blue ball pen. The strokes must be of similar length. The closeness of the strokes also decides on the kind of lightness or darkness the fashion illustrator requires. Now observe carefully that I am adding more darkness to the blue stripes that I have already done. Now you might observe carefully the diagonal lines that I am adding to the rendering. Previously, when I added darkness to the blue stripes, my strokes were much closer to each other. But right now, the strokes that I am drawing are placed away from each other so that too much of darkness is not visible in the rendering. Now again I am drawing diagonal lines opposite to the direction that I have already drawn. This adds a bit of darkness to the rendering. The variation with the previously drawn stripes is reduced by drawing these diagonal lines. This is a method that I have mentioned earlier known as cross hatching.